Good morning, one and all. That is another important topic in the database management system. Today we are going to be discuss with the name of transaction management. In the database, always we are going to be talk about the consistency. In the database management system, many transactions has been happening in every time. So how to manage the transactions properly with a consistent manner of database? Exactly we are talking about in the transaction management. Let us see here what exactly a transaction first. A transaction is a unit of program execution that accesses and possible updates various data items. Let us see we can transfer funds from one account to another account as an example of a transaction. If you do this type of transactions, it should be managed properly. Otherwise, it leads to the inconsistency of database, which is very costly affair. So, in this example of a transaction, we transfer $50 from account A to account B. Let us a simple transaction in this case. Here, we look at there are 6 steps this transaction has been happening, and each step we simply called as an instruction. In this case, look at a first step, read A. It means read the amount in the account A. And the second instruction is talking about deduct $50 from the account A. Once it deducted from A, that remaining can be store this into the memory that in the place of write A. Once it writes it, read the B account's information and add $50 into B as a fifth instruction. Here B is equal to B plus 50, and last we can write this information permanently into the B account. So these 6 steps is simply we call it as a transaction transfer of funds of $50 from account A to account B. Right. This transaction has been happening perfectly, right? Nothing is a problem. But in our scenario, there may be a different types of issues are came into a picture. Let us see while transferring these funds from A to B, in between there is chance of failures. It might be various failures, maybe reason. It may be hardware failures, system crashes, software failures, maybe other different reasons to failure this execution of transaction. Number 1. Number 2, concurrent execution of multiple transactions. Let us see now, we need to understand what is concurrent execution. In every one of us know, we are converted from batch processing into concurrent execution. We can execute more than one transaction simultaneously. It is talking about a concurrent execution. So the multiple transactions are executing concurrently. There is also a possibility of happening inconsistency in the database. So keeping all these things, we need a proper management system to maintain of the transaction execution. This is what mainly concentrate on transaction management. So now let us move. Okay, a transaction has been executing. What are main things we need to be look at? So in this point, initially preferred, there are 4 properties which is very simply called as ACID properties, ACID. So as we discussed, a transaction is a unit of program execution that acts and possible updates various data items. So there is an update in the particular data item. To preserve the integrity of the data, the database system must ensure that integrity and consistency. That's what these ACID properties are going to be looked at. Let us see, there are 4 properties with names. A means atomicity, C means consistency, I means isolation, and D means durability. There are these 4 properties are very essential and important in the transaction management to keep your database consistent. Let us see the first one, atomicity. It indicates very simply in a transaction, either all the operations or the instructions can be executed properly, reflects the database properly, or none are. It means in a transaction, all the transactions executed properly or none of them can be executed. Let us see in a simple, half of the transactions are executed, rest of the half may not be executed. Let in the case of the first transfer funds from A to B, we can deduct from A account 50 rupees. After the deduction, the transaction failures, the $50 may not be added to B account. It leads to the inconsistency. So the term sheet is talking about either all the transactions or all the instructions are executing in a transaction perfectly or none of them. And look at consistency. The execution of transaction isolation preserves the consistency of the database. That's what. Whatever the transaction you have been performed in the database should be preserve its consistency. That is talking about consistency. And isolation. As for in the second thing we discussed about, a multiple transactions may execute concurrently because we are converted from batch processing into concurrent execution. The reason being we transferred from batch processing to concurrent execution to improve the throughput and response time. So in this, each transaction must be unaware of other concurrent execution of transaction. In this case, intermediate transaction result must be hidden from other concurrent executed transactions. Otherwise, it again leads to the inconsistency. The isolation property is looking about the concurrent execution of transactions are going to be taken care. And durability. After transaction completes successfully, the changes it has made to the database persist even if there are system failures. So once the transaction executed correctly, that should be keep properly. The database should be stored properly in the memory. So these four properties are very much important to performing a transaction management system. So to maintain these properties, so let us take a same example what we discussed about transaction to transfer of funds from A to B, a $50. In this case of Atomcity, if the transaction fails after step 3, before step 6, money will be lost. It means execute first instruction, second, third, then failure of this transaction. So it means the $50 deducted from A, but rest 4, 5, 6 does not executed. That leads to the inconsistency. The failure could be due to the software or hardware, whatever it may be, but the database inconsistency occurs. And durability. It is once the user has notified that transaction has completed, the updates of the transaction database must be persist even failure case of either hardware or software. So these are examples to maintain in the properties of transaction. In every transaction should be happening, there are different states, in particularly 5 different states: active state, partial commit, failed, aborted, and committed. Let us see very simple example here. Any of the transaction go for active. So the initial state, the transaction stays in the state while it is going to be executed. It means the active state is ready to execute. And partial commit, after final statement has been executed, it enter into the partial commit according to this. And the failed, once it is not happening properly, this normally execute can no longer proceeded. It's entry into the failed state. Once it enter into the failed state, it is abort. Abort means the transaction has been rolled back, aborted. Once partially committed indicates that last statement is executed. So then it is going to be commit. So the transaction successfully executed. So this is a basic transaction management concepts initially in the transaction management are very essential. So in this presentation we learned what is a transaction and what are the properties of transaction and what are the different transaction states happening in the transaction management. So in the next presentation we can look at the concurrent execution of transaction. Thank you.